The meeting ends faster than expected. A decision has just been announced. A new strategic initiative. A restructuring of priorities. Resources shifting toward a different department. You notice something subtle. Several people in the room exchange glances. Not confusion, recognition. Because the decision did not really happen in this meeting. The meeting only confirmed it. Most professionals notice this moment eventually, the strange feeling that the official conversation is only the final step of something that has already been decided somewhere else. You hear the explanation, you understand the reasoning. The logic sounds reasonable, but part of you realizes something important. Your input could not have changed the outcome, because the outcome was already aligned before the discussion began. That realization creates a quiet discomfort. You assumed decisions were formed inside the visible arena, the meeting, the strategy session, the presentation. But what you are observing is something different. The visible arena is often the confirmation stage, not the formation stage, which means the most important part of decision-making may have happened earlier, and possibly somewhere else. This is the first inversion most professionals miss. Power rarely reveals itself during decisions. Power reveals itself in who shapes the interpretation of the problem before the decision exists. Because the moment a problem is defined clearly, the range of possible decisions has already narrowed, which means whoever defines the problem quietly influences the outcome. And inside most organizations, that interpretive role gradually concentrates, not loudly, structurally. Most people imagine power concentrating through dramatic moments, executive replacements, public reorganizations, leadership shakeups. But consolidation rarely looks like that. Instead, it happens through smaller signals. A meeting that once involved 10 people now involves 4. A project discussion moves from an open forum to a closed conversation. A strategic question is suddenly resolved before it reaches the broader team. Nothing appears confrontational, yet something structural has shifted. The interpretive center of the organization has moved. And when the interpretive center moves, authority follows it, because interpretation determines trajectory. The sociologist Max Weber described bureaucratic systems as structures designed to reduce uncertainty through hierarchy. Authority clarifies who decides. Clarity accelerates coordination. But hierarchy produces a second effect, Weber also observed. Interpretive authority gradually compresses upward. Because complex systems cannot sustain too many competing interpretations of reality, if 20 people define a problem differently, movement slows. If 3 people define the problem, coordination becomes easier. This is the first mechanism of consolidation. This is the moment where power begins quietly changing shape inside an organization. Interpretive compression. Interpretive compression occurs when the authority to define problems quietly moves toward a smaller number of individuals. Not necessarily because they are the most competent, but because the system needs interpretive consistency. Consistency reduces friction. Friction slows decisions. And slow decisions threaten organizational momentum, which means consolidation often begins as an efficiency response. But efficiency creates leverage, because the fewer people who interpret uncertainty, the more influence those interpretations carry. Once interpretive compression stabilizes, another shift appears. Information begins flowing through narrower channels, not because information is intentionally hidden, because interpretation now requires filtering. Someone must summarize the complexity. Someone must frame the problem. Someone must decide which risks deserve attention. This creates the second mechanism, interpretive gatekeeping. Interpretive gatekeeping occurs when a small number of individuals become the primary translators between information and decision. They condense complexity. They prioritize threats. They frame opportunities.
And over time, those framing decisions quietly shape the organization's trajectory.
Because decisions depend on interpretation, and interpretation depends on who controls the frame. Centuries earlier, Niccolò Machiavelli observed something similar about political power. Power rarely belongs to those who maintain order. It belongs to those who define how order is understood. Maintaining stability keeps the system functioning. Defining stability determines where the system moves. Inside organizations, that distinction becomes visible through behavior.
Watch when ambiguity appears. Who speaks first when a problem emerges? Watch when uncertainty slows the room. Whose interpretation reorganizes the conversation? Watch when decisions become final. Which voices remain when the conversation narrows? These signals reveal something important. Power is rarely located in the largest group. It gathers around interpretive gravity. Interpretive gravity forms when a system begins orienting around specific individuals to understand uncertainty. Not because those individuals demanded authority, because their interpretations repeatedly clarified complexity. Once that pattern stabilizes, something subtle happens. The organization begins expecting orientation from them, and expectation changes hierarchy. People start waiting for their interpretation before moving forward. Decisions slow until they speak. Ambiguity lingers until they frame it. This is how consolidation becomes invisible. Authority stops looking like authority. It begins looking like clarity. The organization simply follows the interpretations it trusts most. But those interpretations are not distributed evenly. They accumulate, and accumulation follows a predictable direction. Upward, toward the positions closest to defining how uncertainty is understood, which means consolidation is rarely announced. It emerges through patterns. Fewer interpretive voices, narrower conversations, earlier alignment. And once those patterns stabilize, the structure begins reinforcing them. Because when a system learns where clarity emerges, it begins organizing itself around that source. This is the quiet architecture of power. It does not spread evenly across the organization. It concentrates around the people who define the frame through which decisions become possible. And once that frame stabilizes, influence begins appearing natural, almost inevitable. But there is another layer most professionals rarely see. Because consolidation does not only depend on interpretation, it also depends on something even more structural: dependency. And once dependency begins forming around those interpretive positions, power stops merely concentrating. It begins protecting itself. Protection changes the behavior of the system. Up to this point, consolidation can still appear accidental. Efficiency responses, coordination improvements, decision speed increases as interpretive voices narrow. But once power begins protecting itself, consolidation becomes self-reinforcing. Because the individuals closest to interpretation begin shaping the conditions that maintain their own relevance, not through overt control, through structural dependence. This is where the next mechanism appears: dependency architecture. Dependency architecture forms when multiple parts of the organization begin relying on a small number of individuals to translate uncertainty into direction. At first, the dependence seems harmless. People ask for their opinion. They consult them before making decisions. They wait for their interpretation before moving forward. Over time, something subtle changes. Conversations begin pausing when those individuals are absent. Decisions are delayed until they weigh in. Projects stall when their perspective is unavailable. At that point, dependency has formed. Not emotional dependency, structural dependency. The system has learned that coordination improves when those interpretive anchors are present, which means their presence becomes increasingly necessary, and necessity produces protection. Because removing someone the system depends on introduces instability. Organizations avoid instability whenever possible, which means the positions that produce interpretive stability gradually become difficult to challenge. Not because the individuals occupying them are untouchable, because the system itself has adapted around their presence. This is where consolidation becomes durable. The structure begins reinforcing the positions that produce clarity. Information begins flowing toward them earlier. Strategic discussions begin including them sooner. Ambiguity begins resolving through their interpretation almost automatically, which produces another subtle shift. Access begins narrowing. Not everyone receives the same information at the same time. Not everyone participates in the same conversations. Not everyone sees the same level of uncertainty. Because once dependency stabilizes, the system begins protecting the interpretive layer that maintains coordination. This produces the third mechanism. Most professionals only recognize this change when decisions start appearing finished before they even hear about the problem. Access control. Access control occurs when information about emerging problems becomes concentrated within smaller interpretive circles. Not necessarily through secrecy, but through sequence. Certain individuals see problems earlier. They interpret them earlier. They frame possible responses earlier. By the time the broader organization becomes aware of the issue, the interpretive frame has already formed. And once a frame exists, alternatives become harder to introduce, because the problem has already been defined. This is why consolidation often feels invisible. Most professionals only encounter decisions after the interpretive work has already occurred. They participate in implementation, not interpretation, which means they experience the decision as something that appeared suddenly. But the decision did not appear suddenly. It formed gradually inside a smaller interpretive environment. This dynamic was also understood by Niccolò Machiavelli centuries ago. Machiavelli observed that those closest to the ruler often shape reality not through authority alone, but through proximity to interpretation. They influence which concerns appear urgent, which threats appear credible, which opportunities appear possible. In other words, proximity to interpretation quietly shapes power. Inside organizations, the same pattern appears. Those closest to interpretation influence how uncertainty is understood, and uncertainty determines where the system moves. Once access control stabilizes, a final mechanism appears: narrative authority. Narrative authority emerges when the interpretations of a small group become the dominant explanation for why events are happening. Market conditions, strategic necessity, operational realities. These narratives help the organization understand change. But narratives also reinforce the authority of those who frame them, because whoever explains the environment gains influence over how others respond to it. If a leader defines the market as unstable, the organization prioritizes caution. If a leader defines the market as opportunity, the organization prioritizes expansion. The interpretation becomes the environment. And once interpretation becomes an environment, influence expands dramatically. This is the final stage of consolidation. The system begins orienting itself around a small number of interpretive anchors, not because authority demanded obedience, because interpretation consistently reduced uncertainty. Over time, the organization adapts around those anchors. Decisions form near them. Information flows toward them. Coordination stabilizes around them. And eventually, something remarkable happens. Power stops looking like power. It looks like clarity. People follow the interpretations that make the environment understandable, not the individuals with the loudest authority. The individuals whose explanations repeatedly reorganize complexity. This is why consolidation rarely appears aggressive. It feels almost natural. The organization simply orients toward the people who help it understand uncertainty. But that orientation produces a predictable outcome. Power compresses upward, toward the positions that interpret the system's future before others can see it. At this point, consolidation stops feeling like a process and begins behaving like gravity. Decisions drift toward the same interpretive center. Uncertainty flows upward for clarification. And over time, the organization stops questioning where orientation should come from. Because once a system repeatedly resolves complexity through the same voices, something subtle happens. Expectation forms. People no longer ask who should interpret the situation. They begin assuming the answer. And expectation is one of the strongest forces inside hierarchy. And once consolidation reaches that stage, hierarchy begins behaving differently. Because the system is no longer simply distributing responsibility. It is protecting interpretive gravity, which means the individuals closest to defining the organization's reality begin influencing more than decisions. They begin influencing how the organization understands itself. And that is where power becomes most durable. Not when it controls action, but when it controls interpretation. Once you begin seeing consolidation clearly, another question usually appears.
If power concentrates this way inside organizations, why do most professionals fail to notice it while it is happening?
Because consolidation rarely feels threatening in the moment. In fact, it often feels productive. Meetings become faster. Decisions happen more quickly. Confusion decreases. From the outside, the organization appears more efficient than before. And efficiency creates the illusion that the system is becoming more collaborative.
But something subtler is happening underneath that efficiency. Interpretation is narrowing. Fewer people define what problems mean. Fewer people frame what solutions are possible. Which means most professionals are not participating in decision formation anymore.
They are participating in decision execution. Execution still feels important. Work continues, projects move forward, responsibilities increase. But responsibility and influence are not identical forces. Responsibility expands outward. Influence compresses inward. And once that compression stabilizes, hierarchy begins creating a particular psychological environment, one where most individuals believe they are closer to power than they actually are.
This illusion appears through small signals. You are invited into meetings. You contribute to discussions. You help refine solutions. Your input improves outcomes. But notice something subtle. When a discussion reaches the moment where direction becomes final, the conversation narrows. Some people remain, others are no longer necessary. Nothing confrontational occurs. The meeting simply becomes smaller. That quiet narrowing reveals the true architecture of hierarchy. Interpretation happens upstream. Execution happens downstream. And once those layers separate clearly, consolidation becomes durable. Because the majority of the organization continues experiencing participation, while the interpretive center quietly contracts. This creates what we might call proximity illusion, the feeling that being near a decision means influencing it. But proximity to a decision is not the same as proximity to interpretation. You may hear the reasoning. You may understand the outcome. You may even agree with the logic. But if the interpretive frame was defined before you entered the conversation, your influence was limited from the start. Most professionals misread this dynamic because hierarchy rarely explains itself openly. Organizations speak the language of collaboration, teams, alignment, shared ownership. These concepts help maintain cohesion, but structural incentives operate differently. Complex systems require interpretive consistency. Too many competing interpretations slow coordination, which means consolidation is not usually the result of manipulation. It is the result of structural pressure. Large organizations require fewer interpretive nodes in order to move efficiently, but that structural pressure produces another consequence: distance. Distance between those who define the system's direction and those who implement it. And distance changes perception. The further someone stands from the interpretive center, the harder it becomes to see how decisions actually form. Because by the time information reaches them, the interpretation has already stabilized, which leads to a familiar experience. A decision appears inevitable, not because the decision was obvious, because the interpretive work happened earlier. Once interpretation stabilizes,
alternatives become difficult to introduce.
The room has already aligned around a specific explanation of reality. This dynamic was recognized long before modern organizations existed.
The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that the most powerful forces in human systems are not commands, but interpretations. Whoever defines the meaning of events quietly shapes how others respond to them. Inside organizations, the same principle applies. Those who interpret uncertainty determine which actions appear rational.
And once their interpretation becomes the dominant explanation, influence expands naturally.
Because people do not follow authority alone. They follow the explanations that make complexity understandable. This is why consolidation becomes difficult to challenge. It does not appear authoritarian, it appears logical. The organization simply aligns around the interpretations that reduce confusion,
which means the individuals who provide those interpretations begin shaping more than decisions.
They begin shaping the organization's perception of reality itself. And once perception stabilizes, something important happens. Dependence deepens. Teams rely on those interpretive anchors to understand uncertainty. Managers rely on them to frame strategic risk. Executives rely on them to summarize complexity. At that point, consolidation is no longer just structural. It becomes cognitive.
The system begins thinking through a smaller number of interpretive voices.
And when a system begins thinking through a smaller number of voices, power becomes extremely difficult to redistribute. Not because authority refuses to change, because the organization has adapted around a specific interpretive architecture. Removing those anchors would introduce uncertainty the system no longer knows how to process, which means consolidation protects itself indirectly, through dependence,
through familiarity, through the expectation that clarity will continue emerging from the same place. Once that expectation stabilizes, hierarchy begins reinforcing it automatically. Information flows toward the interpretive center earlier. Strategic questions are raised within smaller circles. Ambiguity is resolved before it reaches the broader organization. Over time, this produces a predictable outcome. The majority of the system operates downstream from interpretation. They stabilize execution. They refine outcomes. They implement direction. But the architecture of direction itself forms elsewhere. Not secretly, simply earlier. This is why consolidation rarely feels dramatic. No confrontation is required. No explicit exclusion occurs. The structure simply learns where interpretation emerges most reliably, and then it organizes itself around that source. This is the quiet architecture of power, not domination. Orientation. The organization orients itself toward the individuals who repeatedly clarify uncertainty. And once that orientation stabilizes, influence stops appearing like influence. It begins appearing like common sense. But recognizing this structure changes something important. It changes how you interpret hierarchy. Because most professionals spend their careers attempting to increase visibility, they speak more in meetings. They volunteer for responsibility. They stabilize difficult situations. These behaviors improve reputation. But reputation alone does not move someone closer to interpretive gravity. Interpretive gravity forms through exposure to how you frame uncertainty, not simply how you execute clarity, which means the most important signals inside hierarchy appear earlier than most people realize. Before the meeting, before the decision, before the strategy becomes visible. The individuals closest to power are rarely those who arrive when direction is being finalized. They are the individuals whose interpretation shaped the conversation before it became visible. Once you understand that pattern, the architecture of consolidation becomes easier to see. Power does not simply accumulate around titles. It accumulates around interpretation, around those who define how the system understands the environment it is operating in. And once that interpretive center stabilizes, authority begins protecting it.
Because disrupting the interpretive architecture of an organization introduces the one thing hierarchy tries hardest to avoid: uncertainty. At this point, the pattern usually becomes uncomfortable to confront because it forces a recognition most professionals resist. Hierarchy does not primarily reward effort. It rewards interpretive relevance. Effort stabilizes outcomes. Interpretation defines direction.
And direction determines where resources move, which means someone can be widely respected inside an organization while remaining structurally distant from where power accumulates. Respect and power follow different incentives. Respect follows contribution. Power follows orientation. Watch how this appears behaviorally. A strategic question emerges. Some individuals immediately begin discussing implementation, timelines, operational impact, resource requirements. Others pause before the discussion moves forward. They ask something different. What constraint is actually driving this decision? What trade-off is the organization trying to resolve? What interpretation of the environment is producing this strategy? Those questions operate one layer earlier. They do not solve the problem. They define the frame through which the problem will be solved. That difference is subtle, but hierarchy treats it very differently.
Because whoever defines the frame quietly shapes every decision that follows. Once the frame stabilizes, the range of acceptable solutions narrows automatically, which means influence has already been exercised before the decision appears visible. This is the layer where interpretive gravity becomes strongest. Not when answers are given, when questions reorganize the environment. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli observed that rulers rarely maintain power simply through authority.
They maintain it by shaping how events are interpreted.
If the interpretation is accepted, resistance rarely forms, because the outcome appears reasonable. The same mechanism appears inside modern organizations. Once an interpretation stabilizes, people align around it naturally, not because they are forced, because the explanation makes the environment coherent. This is why consolidation often feels almost invisible to the majority of the system.
The organization is not experiencing domination, it is experiencing orientation. Uncertainty appears, interpretation emerges. The system moves in the direction that interpretation suggests. Over time, that pattern produces something extremely powerful: expectation. People begin anticipating where clarity will come from. They begin waiting for the same voices before forming conclusions. Conversations slow until those interpretations appear. Decisions stabilize once they do. Expectation is one of the strongest forces inside hierarchy. Because once expectation stabilizes, authority becomes almost effortless. Not because someone demanded power, because the environment has learned where orientation tends to emerge. And when that happens, the structure of hierarchy becomes very clear. Power is not simply held, it is gravitational. The organization moves toward the individuals whose interpretations repeatedly make uncertainty understandable. Once that gravitational center stabilizes, something subtle changes. Influence no longer needs to be asserted. It is assumed. The system has already learned where direction tends to originate. Another signal of consolidation appears in how conversations begin. When uncertainty first emerges, notice who is asked to interpret it, not who is asked to solve the problem. Who is asked to explain what the problem actually means? That distinction matters. Solving a problem improves outcomes. Defining the problem determines which outcomes are even possible. And hierarchy treats those two roles very differently. The individuals asked to define the situation operate upstream from decision-making. Their interpretation becomes the starting point for everyone else. Once that starting point stabilizes, the organization begins reasoning from the same frame. Alternative interpretations become harder to introduce.
Not because they are forbidden,
because the system has already aligned around a particular explanation of reality.
and once explanation stabilizes, direction tends to follow it, which leads to the final realization. Power inside organizations rarely spreads evenly. It compresses, gradually, quietly, toward the positions that interpret the system's future before others can see it. Most people never notice this compression while it is happening, because they are focused on execution, on responsibilities,
On performance. But hierarchy is rarely defined by who works hardest. It is defined by who defines reality earliest. Once that distinction becomes visible, something changes. You stop measuring power through proximity to decisions. You begin measuring it through proximity to interpretation. And once you see where interpretation actually lives inside the system, the structure of hierarchy stops feeling mysterious. It becomes predictable, because power rarely hides. It simply gathers around the interpretations the system has learned to trust. It simply concentrates where the system repeatedly finds clarity. And once that concentration stabilizes, the architecture of the organization quietly forms around it. Not through force, through interpretation, through expectation, through the slow gravitational pull of the voices that consistently make uncertainty understandable. Once you see that pattern clearly, hierarchy stops feeling mysterious.
That is how power consolidates, quietly, at the top.